All right, welcome everyone. We appreciate you guys being with us today as we have a special presentation on orthogonal testing in assisted living populations, specifically for nursing homes. This is really gauged towards nursing home administrators and health professionals that work in nursing homes, as well as their staff, so that you guys can have a better understanding of how to not only plan for, but also to carry out very well planned testing procedures so that you can not only keep everybody safe, detect infections, but also keep it in a budget so that it doesn't, it'll cost you the least amount possible. And I know that that's important for a lot of your businesses that are out there. So we invited Rick to join us today, and Rick Rummel is the senior staff here at US Health Diagnostics in charge of testing. And he's prepared this presentation for us today to help you guys get a better understanding of how to run this in your nursing facilities and assisted care facilities. So Rick, why don't you take just a minute and go over your background so they can understand a little bit better who you are, and then we can then just jump right into it, and we'll get into the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Chris. My name is Rick Rummel. I've been in the medical device industry since 1988 and have been associated with COVID testing and really all things COVID for the last 6 months. There's been some really interesting developments as scientists have learned more and more about this ravaging virus. And I have a father in assisted living and fully understand the ramifications of having an enclosed environment with a lot of residents, and also the necessity really to protect those residents. So hopefully we can touch on a couple ways today that will give you some background information about testing, and then a recommended testing algorithm that has come from the CDC. So we'll have some questions and answers at the end, or we'll have time for that. But if you have something important, please do feel free to interrupt me. So let's talk about the advantages of orthogonal testing, but let's get into first some of the background and some of the types of tests that are out there, and then we'll tie it all together at the end. In early January, actually late December last year, a novel coronavirus, now known as COVID-19, was detected in Wuhan, China, and it seemed very much like a viral pneumonia. And its first cases, as I said, were onset in December 2019. The Chinese government at that time enlisted several companies to go out and develop an antibody test and other testing methods. In other words, enhance the PCR methods for detecting the virus itself and the antibodies made out of that virus. Coronaviruses are enveloped RNA viruses that are zoonotic, so they can be passed from animals to human and other mammals. So they're really kind of unique or interesting viruses in that they can infect a wide range of animals, mammals, and specific once it's jumped to humans, as we've all seen, it can become very devastating. There are 6 coronavirus species, so the one that we're dealing with now is not the first, and it's interesting, we're starting to see some of the potential vaccines come out of the original coronaviruses. So let's begin with some basic terminology, and that is antigen. And an antigen is a substance that provokes an immune response. And typically, antigens are things that are infecting the body. They're proteins that are in the body, and the body wants to get rid of them. And so we'll talk about antibodies being the search and destroy mission armaments for going after antigens. But think of antigens as a protein that is a foreign body that the body wants to get rid of. An antibody is produced by the body when fighting a virus or a foreign body or bacteria. A protein response to an antigen is basically the virus. It's the body's response to the antigen. The first antibodies, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, were collected in Wuhan, China in December of 2019. And those were from people's bloodstreams who had the virus. From those antibodies, the antigens that were causing those antibodies were identified and then produced. We'll talk about that in a second, but basically what all of the antibody tests out there utilize is the antigen that came from the original virus in Wuhan. There are two different antibodies that have been identified. One has a label of IgM, and Ig stands for immunoglobulin, and they're just labeled as M and G. And those are sometimes common labels for other viruses or other antibodies, rather. So it's interesting to see, how some of these things kind of cross-pollinate. All right, so IgM. IgM is an antibody that would indicate the acute infection phase in a patient. It's the first response that a body has to that antigen. And the IgM concentrations show up typically for COVID on the first day after the incubation period. So when a patient is in acute phase and has symptoms. And they remain around until about day 30, day 28, somewhere in there. Any patient tested with an IgM concentration should be in quarantine. After a patient has had the virus for a while, they begin to produce a second phase antibody, which is called IgG, or immunoglobulin G. And concentrations of this antibody show up in the bloodstream around day 8 and will peak at day 28, but then they also last for as long as 5 months. The one thing that a lot of people think of is the IgG is the immune antibody, but it's been very difficult right now to scientifically identify whether the IgG is an actual indicator of immunity, but it certainly shows past infection and past exposure to the virus. Going back to IgM for 1 second, it is possible to have an elevated IgM antibody or an elevated IgM and IgG at the same time and not be symptomatic. So someone could have elevated antibodies because they've been exposed to the virus, but not be symptomatic. And it's really important to understand that, especially in a nursing home population. By using an antibody test, you can find out if someone is asymptomatically carrying the virus or able to transmit the virus to other residents. When both antibodies are positive for the patient, so if we were to do a test and somebody were IgM and IgG positive, they should be quarantined. So someone with an IgM or an IgM and IgG at the same time should be in quarantine. If they just have a positive IgG, they were exposed, but they are no longer infectious, and they could intermingle with the rest of the population. And you can feel very confident that they're not going to be giving the virus to someone or getting the virus from someone. An antibody test window for the different antibodies, IgM is typically detected at about the time of symptom onset. That could be in about 40% of patients. The IgM and IgG show up together at around day 14 because IgG is coming up at around day 7 to day 14. And then IgM is detectable for up to 28 days, and then IgG is detectable for up to 5 months. So an IgG test is really useful for, say, a new resident or someone coming in, and you can see if they have been exposed to the virus or not. Certainly testing your day workers, your staff that come in, or the outside visitors. For example, they're outside caregivers that come into my father's facility, and they come in daily, but they could be nurses, they could be nurses' aides, they could be nurse practitioners. The thought is that those individuals that are visiting every day should be tested on a regular basis. So that's the antibody test window. Antibody testing is basically a response to the global pandemic, and it is a 10-minute simple point-of-care test using a lateral laminar flow immunoassay. I'm reading it, I'm sorry, but it's very important to understand it's a rapid test. And what happens is a drop of blood goes onto the test cassette, and then 2 drops of a special buffer that carry the antigen up to, or antibody up to the antigen. And then when the antibody and the antigen interact, then you get a bar across the test cassette. So if you look in the picture here, you'll see a G that has a red in it. That is indicative of a positive for IgG. The C is a control bar, and the M would be negative in this example. So there was no IgM antibody in this blood sample. So antibody testing, the FDA has updated its policy and included guidance for tests for antibodies. Negative results do not rule out SARS-CoV-2 infection. So COVID-19 negative results are not ruled out, particularly in those who have been in contact with the virus. So it's important to follow up with molecular testing if someone has outward symptoms. Results from testing are not the sole basis to diagnose. This is not a diagnostic test. It is more of a screening test. And we'll talk about that a little bit further in the orthogonal model. Positive results may be due to past or present infection. That's because we're testing for 2 different antibodies, and we can show present would be IgM, past would be IgG alone. So it's important to understand that. In a typical test, this is an example of a test from a company called Biolab Sciences. There's a test cassette. That's it's in that foil pack there. There's a lancet. All we need is 1 drop. There's 1 drop of blood. There's an alcohol swab and a pipette along with the buffer. The pipette is typically used to collect the buffer and put it into the test cassette. Next test is a PCR. This is what we all know a little bit better as a nasal swab test. A PCR test is basically it's a method called a polymerase chain reaction, and it's a molecular test. So this is actually testing for the RNA of a virus. So what happens in this is that typically with a nasal swab or a throat swab, and now even spit, and we'll talk about that in a minute, fragments are collected onto those swabs. And then an enzyme is used to transcribe the RNA into the associated DNA. And then the DNA is amplified or replicated many times so that it can be identified. It's a diagnostic test. It's done in a high complexity laboratory. So the swabs can be collected at your facility and then basically sent to a local lab or a lab anywhere. And then the results will come back next day, or sometimes longer. I've talked to some nursing homes that have to wait 5 and 6 days for results. And during that time, anytime you're waiting for results, you must likely have the resident quarantined. These tests are very accurate. They're 100% accurate for the most part, as long as there are no mistakes done in the test itself. Tests should be for those acutely infected, and those who are tested for PCR or with PCR should be quarantined. It detects after initial exposure, so somewhere in the incubation period of the virus, a PCR will pick up the virus RNA. The sensitivity will decline after about day 7 of symptoms. So once a patient's had symptoms or a resident has had symptoms for about day 7, the sensitivity or the ability to pick up the virus will be declined unless the individual symptoms are getting worse or not going away. To compare the two, just so you can kind of see as a summary, the antibody test is a 10-minute fingerstick serology, and the PCR, or reverse transcriptase PCR, requires a nasal swab or throat swab or saliva to collect the RNA or RNA fragments. The antibody begins to detect at symptom onset, typically it'll get 40% of the IgMs on day 1. And of course that increases as we go to day 14. So we'll have 100% by day 14. My slide should be changed there. The PCR will detect after exposure, but somewhere after exposure, but before symptoms begin. The sensitivity does decline at day 7 on the PCR, but the sensitivity increases with antibody with time. The window, as I said before, for IgG is up to 5 months. And of course, with IgG, you may have, the individual resident may have immunity. So to show you the different collection methods, one is a nasal swab. You can see that there's a long 6-inch long nylon swab that's inserted into the nasal and goes back to the back of the nasal cavity where really there's typically mucus and phlegm where the RNA will accumulate and can be gathered. That same type of test can be done with the back of the throat. And also there's a new test that we will be able to promote within about a week, maybe 2, of just collecting a simple spit sample, much like the DNA with 23andMe or something like that. Okay, so let's get to orthogonal testing. And, this is all based on recent CDC guidelines. Communities across the U.S. are really faced with challenging ways of trying to understand how much of the virus, how many people are infected by the virus, and how do they do it accurately. Some of the uncertainty, and there's a lot of uncertainty, is the symptoms and infection rates vary widely, depending on population and geography. So when we talk about population, think about the residents and how they interact with your staff, or how they interact with guests or people who come on to the campus from outside. Also, the estimates of current and past viral infection have been significantly underestimated. There's a study, and I'd be happy to send it to you, that was done by Stanford University on a population of 3,300 people in Santa Clara, California. And it showed that many more people had been infected or exposed to the virus that had no symptoms. And so it's very interesting to see that we're seeing antibodies in such a large, this is an antibody test, in such a large population, in a very small percentage of those people actually had symptoms. Symptoms vary from infectious with no symptoms to severe infection. And that's also an issue. And does prior exposure to the virus create immunity to reinfection? And if so, for how long? A lot of different issues to deal with. Testing of a representative population for current and prior viral infection is required to determine the extent to which a viral infection has occurred within a community. So basically, what this is suggesting is that an entire community really does need to be tested. As we hear all the time on the news, we need to test. We need to test because we don't know who has it and who doesn't, and you can't take really good precautions to shelter those who are not infected or those who are infected from others. Now, the CDC guidelines in communities where the background prevalence is low, less than 5%, it's very difficult to find out who has it and who doesn't. And so what has happened is they employed an orthogonal test algorithm such that if 2 tests were used, it could be 2 antibody tests, 2 PCR tests. What we think even better is an antibody test followed by a PCR will increase the positive predictive value by 3 times within any given population, which will give a far more accurate picture of who has and who does not have infection and who could be potentially exposed to that infection. So the algorithm, there's a couple of definitions. Positive predictive value is the probability that individuals with positive test results are truly antibody positive. And the same with negative. Those who are negative, predictive value will show that they're actually antibody negative. So the CDC recommends strategies that can be used to improve positive predictive value, and that is choosing a test with high specificity or true positives will yield a high positive predictive value in populations tested with prevalence greater than 5%. So an algorithm needs to have a very, very accurate test. And the antibody tests out there that are EUA authorized by the FDA are highly specific and highly sensitive. So we're in a good place with those now. Now that the EUAs are out and everything has been vetted, we know we've got good tests. Effective algorithms are based on testing a patient sample with two tests, as I've talked about. So that's where we talk about antibody and molecular. So combining the antibody test we talked about first and then a PCR test is also very desirable. So if we take those two combined tests, we improve our ability to detect tests in any given population. But if you have a population of nursing home residents where you probably have 0 to maybe 5% of people who have been exposed or are actually infected, we can pick up all of those infections a lot better with an antibody test, which can be used as a screen, and then a PCR to diagnose and then make sure that we're taking care of the population. So understanding, it's very important to understand that an antibody test may be specific for COVID-19 or may not. We can pick up antibodies in any sort of response to an antigen. But the PCR, so that's why an antibody test is not diagnostic, but a PCR is diagnostic. So you screen for antibodies to the virus, and then you're confirming with a PCR. Basically, what you could have is antibodies for some other infection, but you know for sure you've got COVID-19 if you've done have a positive PCR test. So it's very, very effective to do an orthogonal test and employ two tests. So windows of detection, this is an interesting graph, and this has been refined multiple times since the onset of the virus. The green line is the onset of symptoms or onset of SARS-CoV-2, and that's the presence or concentration of RNA. And you can see it increases from day of infection, probably over a 14-day period, to where we see symptom onset. And actually, symptom onset at 5, but it could be as long as 14. And then the concentrations of the virus, the presence of the virus will decline. But at the same time, the antibody response is starting at about day 8 and increasing. And then that antibody, IgM antibody, will dissipate over the first 20 days. And then from there, IgG will pick up at day 14 and push on to as long as 5 months. But the molecular test window, the PCR window, becomes less sensitive and in decline at about day 9 to day 15. Somewhere right in there, we start to see the PCR ability to pick up the virus is going down pretty rapidly. That's where an antibody test also becomes useful. So that's where we are with orthogonal test methods. And I want to thank you. Hopefully I've explained it, and I want to see if you have any questions.
All right, so Rick, thank you for that presentation. We have a couple of questions here from some of the attendees. One of the questions from Ruth is, if we wanted to purchase these, how would we go about doing this?
Ruth, on this slide, thank you for the question and thank you for being on today. On this slide, you will find my email and my phone number. Please feel free to access either of those. I'd be happy to help you out. But we have sources for both PCR and antibody testing. The interesting thing I didn't talk about, the spit test. We've had a number of nursing homes that have said that they are not interested, their patients or residents rather, not interested at all in the nasal swab test, or the throat test, the oral swab test, because it is so uncomfortable. So the spit test, I think, is going to make things a lot more easy for sample collection. We have all of those, and we can put together a program for you and or your nursing home to take care of that.
Right, excellent. So another question from Bert is, how would you implement orthogonal testing in a nursing home?
Bert, that's a great question. As I said during the presentation, we can implement it in a variety of different ways, but what I would suggest is an antibody test for every resident, and then have everybody who visits the population or visits the facility gets tested. I think every caregiver will get tested daily or at least once a week, and that everyone from outside that comes in, be it vendors or doctors, nurses, people who cut hair, things like that, get tested. And then any positives would immediately need to be quarantined if they have an IgM positive or an IgM and IgG, and then they get a PCR test.
All right, very good. Another question from Ronald is, how many antibody tests versus PCR tests should we plan on for orthogonal testing?
It's an excellent question. We typically see that about 13% in a general population, about 13% of people who have an antibody test will have an IgM result or an IgM IgG result. So I would plan on 13%, but we tend to we constantly try to work on that number to refine it, but 10 to 13% is a good number.
All right, very good. Another question is how long does it take for the product to ship?
We're shipping daily. We can have things delivered overnight. We also would arrange with the PCR company to handle the PCR testing.
Okay, great. Next question is what is the smallest number of tests that we can order?
Minimum order quantity is 20 tests.
Okay, and let's see. Trisha is asking if the antibody is screening only, is it effective enough to detect infections versus the PCR?
Hi, Trisha. Yes, as we can see here, once the IgM antibody is at a detectable stage, we will see it, and we almost always see it during symptoms. We can also detect asymptomatic infection with an antibody test. So we do see it while the patient is, or the individual, the resident is actually infected, yes.
All right, super. Okay, we have time for one last question. So this is coming from Barbara. Thank you, Barbara, for being with us today. How long does the antibody test take versus the PCR again?
Oh, thank you, Barbara. I didn't really mention that, I don't think. The antibody test, once the blood drop is put into the cassette, it takes 10 minutes to give an accurate result. Within about 2 weeks, we'll have faster tests that take 3 to 7 minutes. But for right now, it's 10 minutes. These tests are highly sensitive and highly specific, so their false negatives are extremely low to non-existent, and the false positives are equally so, especially for the IgM side.
All right, thank you, Rick. And thank you everyone for being on today. This has been a great overview of the COVID-19 testing, especially with the orthogonal. Well, Rick, why don't you jump over to that last slide there? So we encourage you guys, if you guys have any other questions, or if you would like to reach out to myself or Rick, go ahead and contact us here. Actually, Rick, go ahead and contact him directly and talk to him about maybe your individual needs, or if you have any questions about how to go about this in your own nursing home or assisted living facility. And hope that this was helpful, and we appreciate your guys' time, and we'll see you again on the next training. Take care.